everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. This is Nicole with Topaz. I am very happy to welcome back Blake Rudis. Hi, Blake.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thanks. We're very excited to have Blake here for long exposure photography tips and tricks.
So I just want to start this off first by thanking everyone at Topaz Labs, from Nicole to the entire staff that puts all this together. I know webinars are a lot of work. I tried one and I failed, so I really appreciate the fact that you allow this venue for us to learn from one another here. So what I'm here today to talk to you about is my long exposure photography workflow. Now, I'm not sure what the conventional long exposure photography workflow is for many people, but mine is pretty kind of outside the box. And what I do is what you see here. This is an HDR image that is combined with a long exposure photograph. So how I get that is I shoot a bracketed series of images for HDR, and I know it's ugly and garish, and that's the whole point, but I really want to get the nice detail from my HDR image. And then what I do is I bring the long exposure photograph that I took and I put it right on top of my HDR image. I blend them together and then I paint with a mask to put exactly where I want that long exposure photograph to come in. So what I get is kind of a nice mix of everything. It's kind of like what my eye wanted to see with all the water going all over the place, combined with what my eye did see with the HDR aspect. So that's what I'm going to be showing you here today, not on this image particular, but this is a good setup image so you can kind of see that if you're using this on water, it can work with water, it can work with night landscapes, it can work with skies. The image I'll be showing you today will be working with skies. So what I want to start this out with is kind of how I do this process from the very beginning. So what I do is I shoot 3 bracketed exposures right off the bat. So I set myself up for HDR. I shoot 3 bracketed exposures, a 0, a +2, and a -2. And then I slam all those together in my tone mapping software. The idea of what I'm trying to get in tone mapping isn't necessarily that important. I'm basically trying to get a blanketed kind of 50% gray, bland looking HDR image that I can exploit later, and I'll talk to you about that exploitation process on this exact image. If you want to see a video of me working on this, it's going to be on the website for the link that's going to be shared with this webinar. So there's a video of me actually doing this process. So what I do is I get that 3 exposure bracketed image and I make a 1 tone mapped image. And then I take the long exposure photograph, which is this long exposure photograph from this exact same scene, and I combine them together. And what we end up with is something that looks like this. And this is after everything's all said and done. So one of the reasons why I do this is because I don't really like what I receive from the long exposure photograph. If you look at the long exposure photograph, it lacks contrast. Yeah, it gives me a nice transition for my sky. It looks all milky and creamy and beautiful, like we know everything to be in the long exposure world. However, it's pretty dull and pretty boring. That's why I do this process. So let's go ahead and jump into how I do this using some of the Topaz workflow here. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up the TIFF file that I get out of what I use as Photomatics to create my HDR image. And basically it's just a really bare bones. If you look at the histogram here, I'm just trying to get a nice clean histogram. Nothing crazy. I don't want to go stylish or outlandish right now. I'll do that in the exploitation process, which is better here in something like Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. So the first thing I want to do is in Adobe Camera Raw, and I'm really not going to do too much here. This is where I'd come in and I'd clean up my dirty sensor. So I just noticed that one. I'll go ahead and grab here, and I'll just clean up some of these spots that I see here. You know, even when you just clean your sensor, it seems like there's always something that gets in there. So that's why we can clean it up right here in Adobe Camera Raw. If you're not using Adobe Camera Raw, you can use Lightroom, that's fine. And they both run off of the same engine. So I'll just clean up the spots, and then I'll go into the chromatic aberration removal. And it's really important to remove chromatic aberrations here, because if you leave chromatic aberrations in the tone mapped image and try to combine it with the long exposure photograph, and you remove the chromatic aberrations in one and not the other, it's going to be really hard to line them up, and you'll get this kind of fringing effect around the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to an area that I know has chromatic aberration. And even though it's only slight, there's a little bit of green on this side, a little bit of a purple vignette or purple fringe on this side. I'll just go ahead and hit the remove chromatic aberration button, bring the purples up just a hair, just one, maybe two on both of those, and then bring that into Photoshop. I'm not going to do anything else with it. I don't really need to do anything else with it, especially if I'm using the Topaz products, because like you're going to see here with clarity, I have a lot more room to play with clarity than I do with Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. So the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate my background layer by pressing Command or Control J, and then I'm going to go to Filter, go to Topaz Labs, and go to Clarity. Now, if you've seen several of my webinars here in the past, you know that what I do is I use clarity a lot in the very beginning. And I use clarity first because I love what I can do with this contrast effect here, the micro contrast, the low contrast, and the way that it pulls out contrast in the photo is great, especially on these HDR images, because in these HDR images, I'm really trying to get a low contrast image in tone mapping. I don't want tone mapping to do anything crazy for me. I want to do that myself here in something like clarity. So the first thing I do is I go into the histogram, and I always make sure that the histogram is selected up here, because this is going to tell me a lot about how far I push this. And you'll see that after I do these micro contrast and low contrast adjustments, just how I do that in this process here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase the micro contrast, and I might zoom in a little here because all I'm processing for right now, I don't want you to get caught up on my clouds. All I'm really processing for here is for the detail in the building. I'm really just trying to get a nice processed look for the building itself, maybe the ground. I'm not worried about the sky at all because, like I said, we're going to blend that sky in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit that micro contrast up a little bit. I might go ahead and do the same thing with my low contrast and bring that up a bit. And if you see that it's starting to get really dark in here, don't worry about that right now. I know my histogram is yelling at me saying, Blake, you're dumping all this black information out over there, but I'm not worried about it yet. And I'll tell you why I'm not worried about that once I get down here to these tone levels. So now with the medium contrast, I'm going to bring that up a little bit as well to kind of really bring out the dirty grunginess in this building. And I didn't do this in Photomatics using like the micro smoothing slider because I didn't want it to globally affect the image and look really grungy HDR. There's a better way to do that, and it's right here in Clarity. So if you look at the histogram now, I could also increase the high contrast too. Let's see what happens if I do that. Maybe a boost in the high contrast by a little bit. But you see my histogram now is pushing all the way over here. There's a lot of black information that's being dumped off there. Well, the beauty of these tone sliders down here is where do I want this to end up being? Well, I want to push this information to the right a little bit. So if I grab the slider and I push this to the left, it's going to end up, or push this to the right, sorry, it's going to end up taking that black information that I blew out over here, and it's going to push my histogram over. And as it pushes that histogram over, it's giving me all those black points back. So I'm not clipping in those black areas, but I'm still getting all of that nice contrast adjustments that I had up here. So the same thing happens over here at the white levels. If those white levels start to go down, if I want to push those over to the left a little bit, I can just move that to the left, and then I'll start to push those white points over. And you see my midtones are getting really high over here. So I have the option to bring those areas down, push them maybe closer to my darks if I wanted those midtones to be darker, or push those midtones to the right to make them brighter. So I might just increase them just a little bit to make them a little bit brighter. So if you look at this now and we look at our before and our after, here's our original. It's very bland. There's everything's pretty much on the same contrast plane, so everything looks all the same kind of contrast level. Now we've opened it up. We've given the scene some nice clarity. Love the name there. So now what I'm going to do is, because I have the option to do it, is I'm going to go down here into the hue saturation adjustments and modify this even more, because what I'm seeing here is that this didn't affect some of the areas that I wanted. I want this area to be a little bit darker. And I know that by looking at this, if I were to go into the saturation of my colors and increase the saturation of, say, the color orange, there's a lot of orange in here. And I'm not going to increase that saturation to get this look. What I'm increasing it for is just to find out what color exists here. And once I find that out, I can then go to the luminance value of that given color. And I can drop that down a little bit to make those oranges a little bit darker. And what I'm doing here is I'm recapturing that depth that I lost from the tone mapping process. The tone mapping process is great because it really opens up our image so that we can see everything, but what it does is it destroys our contrast in the process. So it's up to us to resurrect that contrast, and we do that by using our tonal values. If we go to the luminance values of that color, we can then resurrect just the luminance value. That's only affecting the tone of this color. Another thing I want to do here is, because there's not a whole lot of saturation in my yellows, is just kind of come into the yellows and maybe increase the saturation in those yellows a little bit to kind of bring out some of this area here, and maybe even do that in my greens a little bit to bring some of that area back there to get a nice natural looking image. And a lot of times when you boost saturation, people are like, oh, don't do that, you're boosting saturation. I understand that, but there's certain things in the image that our eye wants to see as a viewer. So your eye wants to see areas that have more saturation than others. That's where your eye is going to navigate to. So it's okay to boost the saturation a little bit. Don't go crazy and boost it all the way up there. Take your greens all the way to this level, or maybe change the hue of them so they're all funky looking greens down here. You don't want to do that. That's not good. But what we do want to do is control that. We have absolute control over what happens to the colors in our image. So let's use it to our advantage. I want that area to be green because my eye wants that area to be green. And I can change the luminance value of that to maybe darken that up a little bit too, and kind of push it back. So as you increase saturation, it will increase the brightness values of those pixels. So you got to remember to push the luminance down on that as well. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and open the image, because now I'm going to jump into Topaz detail. And I'm going to do that because I know by looking at these bricks that there's a lot more detail there than what this image is giving me. So I'm going to go ahead and Command or Control J to duplicate that layer, go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and go to Detail. And what I love about detail is its ability to not just manipulate the detail of the overall image, but the ability to manipulate the detail in your shadows, your highlights, and the overall image. So what that means is that you can go into those individual shadow details and bring out or maybe subdue some of the detail that's happening in those shadow areas, and likewise for the highlights. So to do this, again, I'm not worried about my clouds. Don't worry about my clouds. I'm just looking at the building at this point. I'm going to select an area that has a lot of the highlight and the shadow in it, and just kind of zoom in just a little bit on there so that we can see that probably about 200%. So here's a good spot because we got some black areas, we got some white areas. So I can go into those individual shadow areas and highlight areas and increase the shadow detail. And if you look right here, just look what this is doing right around these deep shadow areas in the image. It's better over here so we can see if we take this too far. You see how it's really bringing that out? We don't want to go that far because that's too much. We can go and we can increase some of the detail in those shadows. If you're a fine art printer and you really want to make your prints look better, you can increase the detail within those shadow areas so that those shadow areas aren't just black printed spots. You now have some detail in them. So that's a pretty good idea to do. So we can increase the medium details a little bit there too. Now when you see this medium details boost, I don't really spend too much time into the detail boost because I think that these detail sliders alone give me a pretty good working area here, especially on this photograph. It's most times if I use these detail boosts, I drop it down a little bit. So as I increase the medium details up here, I drop the boost to kind of feather the edges of those boosts so that they aren't quite so striking and so powerful. So that's a good technique. So instead of, a lot of times you think, boost, let's go this way. Well, if you go the opposite way, it kind of works like the clarity slider in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, where if you move it to the right, it increases the contrast in your micro details. If you move it to the left, it kind of makes them fuzzy. And we can do the same thing with the large details, just bring that up a little bit. Now let's look at the highlight areas right here. So we'll look at these highlight spots right here. And we can increase the details of those small details in those highlights. And again, if you go this far, you've gone way too far. And you really it's just very small, slow adjustments. I mean, most times when I use detail, I don't go past 0.2 for my adjustments here. You see, I'm not going very far on these detail adjustments, but you can see the amount of detail that this has brought forward in this image. It's really nice. So then we can go to the overall, and if we want to do the same thing on the overall image, it's going to not just affect the shadows and the highlights, but it's also going to come in and strike those midtones a little bit. So I'll polish those off just a little bit more too as well. And that's probably going to be pretty good. So let's go ahead and open that up, press OK. So now we've got a lot of detail in here, and if it's too much, if I went too far, and that's what it kind of looks like to me because I was zoomed in, it's okay. If you go too far, it's fine because you have the opacity slider here in Photoshop. I can always just drop this opacity a little bit and kind of make that about 50%. I'm going to go halfway on what I did there because that was a little too much on my detail. I'm really just trying to clean that up just a little bit. A lot of people use detail as a finishing type of sharpen. But what you're going to see here is that I'm pretty much finished with this portion of the photo. So now what I need to do is I need to bring my long exposure image in. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the long exposure photograph and get myself prepped up and ready for this. So what I want to do here is, you can see this long exposure photograph. There's a lot of information here that's not quite available to me. What I'm trying to do is get these streaks. There's streaks that are happening up here that we don't really see. So if I increase the contrast in here and I drop the highlights and I drop the shadows, you can start to see those streaks coming out, and I can kind of manipulate those streaks to get out a little bit more. The problem is I'm not getting them as strongly as I'd like to. So I'm going to just kind of go in here and get them to a point that I like them in Adobe Camera Raw, and that's good for now. Maybe increase that contrast a little bit. Really just trying to exploit these streaks at this point. I don't care about the rest of the image. All right. So the only reason why I took this long exposure was not for the building. It was for all the stuff that's blasting around it. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this image. Oh, and what did I forget? I forgot to do my chromatic aberration reduction. So let me go ahead and do that now. Because I'm in Photoshop CC, I can press Control-Shift-A, and that will open up Camera Raw as a filter. And that's why I love it. I'll zoom in here, and I'll do the same chromatic aberration reduction that I did in the image before. So this happens to me a lot. That's why I like having Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. So I'll go ahead and fix that up, and I'm pretty much good there. So now that I've got this, what I need to do is really exploit these streaks a little bit more. So what I found actually is that Topaz Simplify does a great job of extracting those streaks. So I'm going to open Simplify. I'm not worried about duplicating my background layer, because this is going to be kind of a, I don't want to say a throwaway, but it's kind of a throwaway image. We're only using it for the sky. So I'm going to go ahead and reset all these to the basic that they were at, the default settings here. And there are two sliders in Simplify. Simplify is a pretty cool program to make very, what they call, simplified images. It makes some really interesting black and white, artistic, almost painterly type stuff. It's kind of like impression, but not as powerful, in that it just simplifies the detail in your image and gives you almost these illustration type look in your photograph, whereas impression is more of a fine art side look. So Simplify is more like your graphic design style, and impression is kind of like your Monet painting look. So let's go ahead and get these back to all their default settings. And the only sliders that I want to affect here in order to make these streaks come out is actually going to be right here in the Adjust section. In the Adjust section, you have these two sliders. There's one called Dynamics and one called Structure. Watch what happens here when I increase the Dynamics and the Structure. Those streaks really start to come out. And obviously, this is a little too far. I just wanted to kind of show you that wow factor of just how much information is actually in this RAW file that we can't see, but we can extract with other things that we couldn't necessarily do with something like Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom by itself. And I don't need to simplify this image. I don't need it to look like a graphic design concept, but these dynamics and structure sliders are really important here in Topaz Simplify, because what they offer is this nice kind of contrast adjustment without bringing about a whole lot of noise, because of the simplify mentality behind it. So in here, if we wanted to, we could also increase the saturation a little bit to kind of bring out some of that blue. I'm not going to do a saturation boost, but I think we can get away with about that. That looks about good. And I'll go ahead and open this up. So what I've done here is I've prepped my foreground, I've prepped my background, and now it's time to get them both to interact with each other. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to grab this one, I'm going to press V for my Move tool, and I'm going to click on this layer and drag it and drop it right into this one, and press and hold Shift while I do that. That will make sure that they align from the center. Now Photoshop is very intuitive in that it can align your images pretty well. But it's not always perfect. You can see as I turn this on and off, you can see that there's a slight movement, and that slight hair of a movement is going to be imperative for the rest of our photo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these, and I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to merge these down. I'm going to Control-A, merge these down, because they're all done. My Topaz clarity adjustments are all done there. So now what I'm going to do is select both of these, and in the Move tool you have this object right here. This is your Auto Align Layers. So I'm going to just set it to auto. Just go ahead. And what it's going to do is it's going to try and find all of my edges and make sure that my image is matched up. But how do we know if Photoshop did a good job? Well, let's change this to Difference Blend Mode. And when we do that, we get this really ugly nastiness. Don't worry about that. I'm going to zoom in right here to my window. And you see how there's a slight blue here. When everything's lined up, everything should turn almost like a blackish color. So we're off by not even a 32nd of an inch in my photo, but that will make a huge difference. So I'm going to move this until everything turns black and is almost aligned. You might have to press the control key in order to do this. But you see how now we have a, if I go into the history here and you watch that move, however, all these blue areas here, that's basically showing me that those areas are not aligned, and now these areas are aligned. That's really cool. So now if we look at the before, all of our trees kind of have this fringing on them. It's because they aren't lined up correctly, but now they are. The little excess that you see on the side here, remember how I told you about chromatic aberrations? Those are now what you're seeing on the sides. So we are going to have a little bit of a difference there, but it's not that big of a deal. So now what I can do is I can just change this back to normal and turn the eyeball off, because I'm going to use this layer as my base layer to create a mask from. So I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Remask. Now, if you're an excellent masker in Photoshop, go ahead and flaunt your excellent masking skills in Photoshop to do this. I prefer two methods in Remask, and one of the methods is to actually go along and trace everything here in blue and then paint bucket in for what I want to take away. And that could take a while, so I'm not going to show you that method now. What I'm going to show you is the ultra fun way to do it, where we draw a bunch of smiley faces on our image in order to create our mask. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to fill this all with blue. So it's all blue. And what blue is like, hey, Topaz Remask, I'm having trouble with this area and I don't feel like masking it. Can you do it for me? That's what blue is. Green is whatever you paint green is going to stay, and whatever you paint red is going to take away. So green stay, red take away, and blue help. Okay, so keep that in mind. So we have this whole image basically saying help here. I'm going to go ahead and fit this into the size. And what I want to do is the areas that I want to stay are going to be the building. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of haphazardly kind of draw lines here and just kind of go in here, and I can draw just really easy, fast, quick lines on this, and like I said, make smiley faces. But what I want to really kind of touch on are these edge areas. Just make sure I kind of hit these edge areas a little bit. And this is kind of the beauty of Topaz Remask, is that you just barely show it what you want to keep and barely show, oh, there's another smiley face opportunity. Oh, there's another smiley face opportunity. Okay, cool. And we'll just go through like this, and this is telling Topaz Remask what to keep, and then now we get to go and tell Topaz what to take away. So when I do this, I have my fingers on the Q, W, and E key. Q is going to be green, W is going to be take away. So I don't have to keep going over here, and E is going to be blue. Okay, so now I can just go like this, make another smiley face here, take this out, another smiley face here, take this out, and then another smiley face here, and then one right here, a really small one. Oh, he's got eyebrows. And then we'll just go in like this and take that one away, and then take this away. And then I'm just going to touch a dot right here, a dot right here, a dot right here, a dot right here, and a dot right here, and one right here. Boop. Okay, and then maybe just go back to that green real quick. And then what you'll see is when I press Compute Mask, it's going to just, boom, it's going to make a cool mask. Everything's almost perfect. You see how there's like this fringing that's kind of happening around here? Not that big of a deal. It's just the quick method that we used. So if we get a bigger brush that's red, big red brush, and just click on those areas that we don't want it to have there, it will take those areas away for us. Really, really powerful kind of tool here. And any area that we need back that isn't quite coming back, we can just take the blue and just go over that area right here and say, okay, that's one of those trouble areas. This is one of those trouble areas. Hey, this was a trouble area. This was a trouble area. And you see how it's intuitive, it's smart. It's saying, okay, I know what you're talking about here. I know that you don't want that. And it's really easy. It makes masking super fun, super simple, because you know, most times with masking, you've got a frowny face on because you're really unhappy with the mask that you're getting. But with Remask, you can have a nice, happy, smiley face on the whole time. And you can draw happy faces, and it still makes a good mask. And again, if it creates too much inside these areas, just little red clicks in here and everything works out good. Now the area with the trees, that's definitely an area that we need to discuss, because those tree areas did not get selected up here in the corner, and that's not that big of a deal, because what I'm going to do is you have these options up here. You can show that tri-map that we had. You can show the actual mask. You can show what's being kept, and you can show the original. So I'm going to go back to the tri-map, and what I want to do is now I'm just going to draw little green lines in here on these areas of the trees that I want to keep, and now we'll go back to our mask and see what Remask decided to accept. Okay, so now we got these kind of really bad looking areas here. If we get that blue brush, that's my help brush, help me, I need you to fix this for me, and just kind of click around, and Remask will find those areas for me. It's usually pretty good about this. And it doesn't have to be perfect in this case. In this case, it doesn't have to be perfect because I'm taking one image that's the exact same as the other image, and I'm aligning them. So if some of the residual stuff comes up with the other image, I'm not too worried about it. If I was going to drop a sky in here that had nothing to do with this scene because the sky I took was horrible that day, then I would worry about making a much better mask. But this mask is actually very good for what I'm going to be doing here. Okay, so now if I go ahead and press OK, it will make that on a new layer. So it creates a new layer right here. So now what I need to do is get this layer under this layer. So I'm just going to drag this right underneath, and now boom, we got the best of both worlds now. We are cooking with oil. But you can see on the top and all these edges here, in the process of Photomatics making sure that your images are aligned, sometimes it makes your image a little bit larger than it should be on these edges. So I'm going to press the crop tool, and I'm just going to crop in right here and crop all this out. Okay. So that's pretty good there. That's pretty good there. And now we almost have everything kind of perfect where we want it to be, right? But the blue here does not match my background here. So we got a little trick. And this little trick is to press Control, Shift, Alt, and E. And that's going to make a stamp of everything that's going on below here. And I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, and Average. And that's going to give me, when I look at this, it's going to give me the average color of everything that's happening down here. So and what I'm doing is I'm trying to use the color theory principles in painting. That if you paint with, so in this image here we have too much blue. But we need to know exactly what color will be the complement of its opposite. So if we take this and we press Command or Control I, that will invert it, and then we can then change this to something like color or soft light, drop the opacity all the way down, and slowly incorporate it in. And what that does is it mixes the overly saturated color with its complement to subdue it. And that will get our color temperatures kind of in line with each other and make it look all better. So now I'm going to make another stamp, Control, Shift, Alt, and E. And that stamp, I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Restyle. And Restyle is pretty cool because you can create some nice color temperatures happening in your photograph. And a lot of these don't look very good at all, and that's okay. Because you're not looking at it for the face value here. You're not looking at this for the face value of what this is giving me right now, because it's not that great of a color. But if I go into the blending options, which this is very important with Restyle, go into the blending options, change it to something like soft light or overlay. Let's go to soft light, and then drop this opacity down and slowly incorporate that color back in. You see how this is working now? Are you starting to see a pattern here? Is that sometimes you don't always need to work at full force. You go down to 0 and build your way up rather than starting out at the top and working your way down. This is particularly important with something like Topaz Restyle. It's great for giving you some nice color temperatures over your image, especially because it allows you to control those. So if you go into the saturation and the hue and the luminosity of all of these different colors that it's giving us, we can actually see where these colors are. So now I can see that this color, this fourth dimension color here, is actually happening right here. So I can go into luminosity there and maybe brighten that up so that that part gets a little bit brighter. So my eye naturally goes right towards that area first. So you get the ability to manipulate those color gradings that are happening on your photo. And this is something that you can't do in some of the color grading stuff in Photoshop. You know, a lot of times I'll use a gradient map to give myself a nice color grade over the entire image. But the problem is that I don't get a whole lot of control over the hue saturation of those colors that I'm adding. So I have to make sure that the color matting is perfect. However, with Restyle, you get the ability to adjust the hue saturation and luminance of those colors right here in the program. And really, I mean, you see here that I chose the image that the color that I chose here works out perfect. If you saw the original though, this color choice does not seem like it would be very good. I can choose any color over here. I'll even be brave. I'll choose this one. And I can choose any color over here, any color combination, and I can probably make it look pretty good just by going to something like soft light and then dropping this opacity down and getting everything to kind of combine. And this is basically just putting a nice blanket cover over the entire image as a whole. And I'll go ahead and press OK. And that'll open me up in Photoshop. Now, if you don't like the overly streaking that's happening here, let's go ahead and close that eyeball off. What you can do with this this layer that we created here for those streaks in the background is you can drop the opacity here and kind of bring back the clouds that are happening underneath it. So you get this kind of like magical, what the heck is going on? We got this like semi kind of long exposure thing going on with this, you know, clouds that we can see in the background. And I actually like to do that a lot because it creates an added depth to the image that isn't, like when we have this at 100%, it looks kind of contrived. It looks like we're trying too hard. But if you drop this down, let me go ahead and delete this restyle layer. If we drop that down and then maybe even add a mask here, we can get a really big brush on that mask and just hit right here in the center of this image on that mask by painting black to make that one spot kind of go away a little bit. And then you start to see kind of the clouds appearing around the focal point, which is actually kind of a cool touch. So I do like that. And at this point, you could go ahead and then flatten that all down and then also do your restyle on top of that if you'd like to as well. A couple of things we can do to this to really kind of take it to that next level is make a vignette on it. A vignette is a good way to pull someone into the center of your photograph. So what I'll do is I'll create a new layer, press Shift F5, fill it with black, and then drop the opacity down to something like 50%, make a mask on it, and then paint with black on that mask on the areas that I want. This is a custom vignette. This isn't a vignette that's just going to create shadows around my sides. This is a custom vignette based on what I want my viewer to see. And obviously, if that's too much, you can drop the opacity a little bit. And sometimes it's a good idea to put a spotlight on it, especially in one of these long exposure type images, because it almost looks like you put a spotlight on it when you were there. Go to the curves, bring the curve up to make it pretty bright, change this to luminosity so it affects tone and not color, maybe drop the opacity a little bit on there, and do the same thing. Make a mask on it and paint with black on that one center spot, or white, I guess, because we're trying to bring it back, on that one center spot right there that you want the eye to go to. So just those two little things added a lot of depth by pulling us into that image. And then on this one, it'd probably be a good idea to maybe even make a curves adjustment layer that looks like an S curve. And then boom, there we go. So we've got, we started with, this is what we started with. This is just the Topaz clarity and Topaz detail. Then we added that long exposure photograph to it. We added that color temperature correction to it. We added the remask to it to combine the two of them, and then our vignette and our curves adjustments to really kind of pull this and pull it off the page a little bit. And that's all fine and well if you have the ability to use something like a 10-stop neutral density filter like I use there. But if you don't have the ability to use a 10-stop neutral density filter, what do? Well, I don't know if you know this, but the best Photoshop artists are pathological liars. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lie about the fact. So here I didn't have my neutral density filter on. I was actually walking around doing a photo walk and teaching some people some stuff. So I didn't want to take the time to put my neutral density filter on. But I just knew because the clouds were moving so fast that it would have been a perfect experience for it. But I didn't do it because I didn't have the time. So what am I going to do? I'm going to press Command or Control J. If I'm at this point, in the PDF download for this, there is a document that's going to have all of these step-by-step instructions on it too. So you can watch the webinar later, and you can also go download that PDF document to kind of see how this works. So first thing I'm going to do is Command or Control J, duplicate that background layer, and then I'm going to get my clone stamp tool. And what I'm trying to do here is actually make a lot of clouds that I have here, but over the entire photo. So I'm going to just press Alt and click here and then just cover this area in clouds. And it's going to look like something bad. It's not going to look good at all. And I'm not doing with any set style or purpose. I'm just trying to duplicate all these clouds all over the place. And you'll see where I'm going in a minute. You're like, what is this crazy guy doing? And why am I hearing so many clicks when he could just be doing this? What I'm doing is I'm setting myself up for a blur. So what you can do here is you can go into Filter and go to the Blur Gallery and choose something like a path blur. And with this path blur, I'm just going to go ahead and make an interesting kind of blur. I'm going to set myself up with one blur first, and then I'm going to do another blur in a second. So I'm going to add another point here and just kind of make a really weird kind of blur. And you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. This path blur doesn't have to be like this. You can make any path blur you want. Just press OK. So now I'm kind of blurring these clouds out a little bit. I could have used a Gaussian blur. I could have used any blur in the world I wanted to. But the blur that really is going to set this off is going to be the Radial Blur. So I'm going to go to Filter, go to Blur, and go to Radial Blur. With the Radial Blur, you don't get to see a preview. Radial Blur is like one of the oldest blurs, I think, in Photoshop, and I think it's more kitsch than anything. But you want this to be on zoom, and you want it to be on the best quality, and you want to blast this all the way up. Now you can set this right in the center so you get the same effect that we had in the last image, or you can set it off to one of the sides if you wanted to. I'm going to put it off just slightly to the side, maybe down here. Press OK. And this is going to blast those clouds and just shoot them all over the place. The thing about a neutral density filter is when you have clouds that are moving towards you really fast, let's say a storm is coming or something, what happens is those clouds actually look like they're converging into your focal point. So we're emulating the same process here. We're making it look like these clouds are converging into the focal point. It looks like trash right now, and that's fine. I'm acceptable of the trash that I've made here. I'm just going to go ahead and turn the eyeball off on this, and I'm going to use my best friend, which is Topaz Remask. Go into Topaz Remask, and here I'll show you the easy method here, where you don't put smiley faces on. If you're not a person that likes to smile, then you can do it this way. Okay, smiling is fun, and we'll go ahead and just trace this. Bear with me in the awkward silence. If my webcam was on, you'd see my tongue hanging halfway out of my mouth, because that's what we do when we concentrate. And then we'll go down like this and just cover all this stuff up. And basically the blue, like I said before, the blue is the, hey, help me out here. I don't really want to do the hard part of masking this, so you do it for me. Thank you. And now, what do we want to keep? Well, we want to keep the foreground. So let's go ahead and use our fill bucket and fill that background. So I press Compute Mask, and it gives me my mask. Again, it doesn't have to be too perfect at this point. With this one, I would probably go in and maybe clean up these areas a little bit with the green to kind of capture these areas that didn't quite get caught, because I don't want to see them as a blur. So that's good. That's okay. And maybe hit this guy a little bit on that. There we go. And press OK. So now it doesn't look like I did anything. So what I need to do is take this layer 1 and drag it right underneath here. So now look, we got the same thing that we had before. So just tell your friends you just bought this new neutral density filter, but really what you did was you just used a Radial Blur, and you don't have to tell them that. You can be the best pathological liar in the world because you're a Photoshop artist. And again, you can exaggerate this layer if you want. You can go into something like Topaz Simplify again, like I showed you before. You can go into Simplify, and you can go into those global adjustments and this adjustment here and increase those dynamics to really make a nice dynamic and structurally available image here. And if it starts to mess with your contrast a little bit, ooh, that's yuck. That's yucky. Let's drop the saturation a little bit so that we don't get a lot of that. Maybe drop the dynamics just a little bit and press OK. And there we have very much the same of what we had before, where we're kind of faking it. I mean, it's not your long exposure shot that you had before, but you know what? I'll tell you, this is really close. I've shot hundreds and hundreds of cloud long exposure images, and this radial blur is very similar to what happens in the sky. Now, if you don't want them converging in the center, maybe try a motion blur to the left and right. Maybe try something else. You can get kind of crazy with it. And from here, what I would suggest is pressing Control Shift Alt and E. Now you have a stamp of everything below. What you can do with all these areas below is put them into a group by pressing Control G. So now you have all of your history. This is all of your history back here, and this is your new image. And From here, you're free to go into Topaz Adjust, Impression, Clarity, whatever, because now you got your baseline image. All I showed you at this point was to get you up to the point that you were ready to make some edits on this photo. So at this point, we could then, maybe go into our curves adjustment, maybe make a little slight S curve here and kind of boost this up. What I would actually do is probably run my digital and color zone systems on this and then move forward from there, because you get really unprecedented control over tone and color.
Thank you so much, Blake. This has been awesome.
Excellent. I'm very appreciative that I was on.
If you have any questions, you can contact us at webinars@topazlabs.com. We'll try to answer them as quickly as we can and get back to you. If you have, or if you're interested in signing up for additional sessions, we're going to have a lot of artistic, creative sessions over the next week and a half or so. You can sign up at topazlabs.com/webinars. And on that page, you can also sign up for our webinars newsletter, where you will be first to know about our upcoming scheduled webinars. All right, so that's all the information. Again, check your emails for that follow-up email, and all this information plus Blake's information will be in there. Thank you again, Blake. This has been great.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are, and I hope you're able to join us on Thursday for our Quick Tip Thursday. Bye-bye.
Bye.